late December 2025, a cyber attack struck roughly 30 electrical facilities across Poland. The operation, attributed to the Sandword Group, targeted communications and control systems as well as infrastructure managing wind and solar energy. Exactly what the attackers intended remains unknown. The security firm Dragos noted that it is unclear whether they attempted to issue potential commands or focused solely on disrupting the communications. Further reporting from cybersecurity firm ESET indicates that the hackers deployed data wiping malware known as DynoWiper. Although the incident did not cause power outages, Dragos reported that the breach allowed adversaries to access operational technology systems critical to grid operations and permanently disable key equipment. This is a story about the electrical grid and how it's becoming targeted again and what the industry can do about it. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
Okay, Rafael Narezzi, CEO, co-founder of Centrii and CEO of Centrii. We are the only one that can translate renewables energy risks into a financial outcome from the cybersecurity perspective.
I'm glad Rafael started with that because I've talked with other people about the impact of renewable energy in our existing electrical grids. On the one hand, it's great that we're moving away from fossil fuels. We're getting all that solar and wind energy, but it impacts the older grids out there. And in addition, it can cause security concerns, does it not?
It does. I think the field that we live today is a decentralized field. Before, I think when I started internet in 1995, long time ago, there was not many generators at all connecting to the grid in terms of a connection from the internet. Managing remote locations, of course, depends on type of assets that we're talking about here. In that situation, the only way for you to attack generators was from a war or a terrorism or a physical situation. So moving forward now to 2026, we are living in a hyper-connected world. Everything is IoT. Everything is talking. You have a merge from IoT, IT, to the OT, which becomes kind of a lot of soup of letters, right? So, and that's where we are today with a landscape of threats is scaling, growing, in the landscape of connection also huge. So today, even though despite the many asset owners from the generation perspective are setting fences and CCTV, what therefore if the risk is digital?
And just to point out something that happened a year ago, we had outages in Spain and Portugal, and immediately everybody was like, oh, that's a cyber attack. But if I understand correctly, there was actually an abundance of alternative energy that wasn't compensated for.
Totally. And I think there's two important connections to attribute to what you're saying there, right? First, the balancing. Yes, it was an issue from the grid perspective. However, there is no explanation yet why two big plants of Spain in peak time during 11 o'clock solar, big sun, suddenly stopped to produce. Right, so we don't have a conclusion of that, despite that we have a conclusion saying that we didn't have enough energy. So, which is the balancing situation. I'm not saying that it was a cyber attack, but we don't have evidence to say that it is.
I'm wondering if there's a particular weakness in OT that Rafael has found, as opposed to like the general IT level of risk.
What's happening and is being happening on the grid moving forward. Poland recently, I think a month ago, has received an attack, which is the same situation, playing with 30 windmills in order to kind of on the relay. So actually not stopping generation of the site, but actually playing with the balancing of the grid, because I think the cyber criminals or the state sponsor acts understand that if I play with the balancing of the grid, I will create a domino effect on the grid. So unfortunately, Poland was more prepared from the battery side, which Spanish didn't have so many batteries to deploy fast in order to kind of a balancing back to the needed, right? So that's the kind of a scenario that we're living. And I understand now that from the balancing situation, we will be able to see more attacks vertical happening. Why? As I just demonstrated on the beginning of our talk, as we decentralize the energy, as we become kind of hyper connected, our landscape is pretty higher than anticipated before. And the targets becomes quite easy to do it. And if I can do a kind of a balancing situation that I can cause grid outage, I don't need to attack the big players. I can go to the small niche players from the generation side, build a capacity, and then, as I call, a DDoS from the energy field, which is multiple generation small sites, which then I can create a kind of maybe a offset demand or more demand the grid needs, and then you have the same situation that happened in Poland or even in Spain.
So you have these batteries that we talked about, but there's also the generation aspect, like the windmill and the solar power panels. There are components there that have been installed without the security concerns that are often necessary.
I think just to illustrate that, who doesn't remember the Ocean's 11 movie when the guy gets a white van, goes to the top of the car park in Las Vegas, and then he press a pinch device, which is actually, if you compare to the likelihood of today, you're going to see a battery, a BESS. So if I dispatch a large volume of battery, which is today, by the way, controlled by username and password, into a grid, what do you expect that will cause into the grid if it's not prepared to handle that kind of a discharge in that time they need it? Definitely going to have a balancing situation. The same thing will happen in your house. If you start to consume a lot of energy and your plug is not up to kind of feed all the energy, your disjunctor goes off. So a similar situation, and the aspect is, how do we control the multiple proliferation of assets that is being connected to the grid? That's one aspect. The other aspect that you're saying, yes, we are growing agrotech, vertical farming, cannabis farm that we already help, data centers, and why we are helping. You're not helping them to produce whatever they produce. We are helping them to protect the energy, because the decentralized field as well becomes an opportunity for business to be in a remote location, actually producing what they do the best, and actually ensure they can actually do what is more essential for them, which is energy. Without energy, there is no business, and that's what we are here for.
Rafael mentioned BESS, and I hope he can deconstruct that and let us know what it means. It's a battery, right?
Yeah, it's a battery, right? It's a battery storage in order for you to discharge when the grid demands more power. So we have cars. It's kind of a BESS if you think about it. However, the cars today only receive the energy. Eventually, as we go more along with the proliferation of smart grid, you might going to be able even to trade your energy of your car back to the grid. I think the grid is not ready yet for that, but I think we see this happening. However, when we see a BESS scenario, which is very common use on the trading aspect, so I charge my battery on the off peak time, and then I discharge on the peak time, and I make kind of my money from there. However, we have optimizers, as it's called, a software that actually connects multiple batteries together. Even the software perspective, which connects to multiple batteries. So I can, instead to attack individually asset owners, I can attack the supply chain, which actually connects all the batteries together and then dispatch all together. So the scenario of the landscape of a connectivity in remote dispatch is out there. However, is how we are protecting, how much visibility you have, and how confident are you that is actually who is dispatching is the person that should be dispatching the battery.
So are there regulations and standards for this, or is it just sort of a free-for-all?
I think start to have certain regulations. NIS 2.0 in Europe is one. NERC CIRP is another one. However, there's different aspects of the regulations. I think the regulations are getting soft. So NIS 2.0, I think, has been better one because they make the director liable and the company even to lose the license. I think NERC is being quite more soft, understanding that they have time to address that, kind of just giving a penalty on the money. We see that, we think is important. I think it's very valid, but doesn't give kind of the penalty for maybe bodies to move. What we see from the NIS 1.0 to the 2.0, NIS 1.0 is start very similar to the NERC SIRP. Similar, like we fine. There is just kind of a give you issue of a fine amount, and that's it. And then when we see the situation of the NIS 2.0, where they kind of first increment the scope, and then also penalize directors to be liable. They are not expecting you to be the best on cyber, but at least the basic is necessary, and that's what we need for. And also the company that is generating the energy. So if I have a company that's generating and I get a cyber attack, am I going to compromise my entire license of operation? Is that worth it? Should I invest a little bit more? And I think that's what I think need to happen more. I'm not saying that we should create a penalty at all to individuals, not at all, because in Japan, for example, there is a regulation there and there is no penalty, but they take as a very kind of a discipline. It's a family shame if they don't do it, and you don't need to have a penalty. So once again, it's more a way of operations than rather than a kind of as a culture, I would say.
So electrical grids, they're kind of brittle in some ways. We have this rapid technological growth going up against that. And these regulatory bodies or whatever, they take years and years to come up with a new standard, which back in the day was fine, but the iteration today is much quicker, much faster. And so the response needs to be there. Is that happening?
I think it is, but not in the speed that we need it. That's what's happening. I think technology is moving faster in every single direction. When I say technology, assets, deployment of generation, I consider as a technology. And that's why it's getting hacked. Many people say, oh, but it's an asset, it's in the middle of nowhere, is just a windmill, it's just a solar panel. Yeah. Yes, they are. But also behind of those are softwares. And softwares, as we know, get hacked. On the IT is very, very common, but OT is falling apart if it did the same part of a kind of a vulnerabilities. So I think in the end of the day, whatever produce electrons, if it's a windmill, if it's a battery, if it's a solar, is a software. And we know, in fact, softwares can get hacked. And if you can get hacked, then you can affect maybe a company. However, there's a big difference between IT and OT. The difference is IT, if I have a cyber attack, I can stop. I just unplug my computer, my server, I take it out, I put offline. Of course, I'm not saying that because probably the IT folks are gonna say, hey, this guy's crazy. I'm not gonna do that, right? I understand, but you have this option. How do I mitigate an issue or an incident on the energy, which I cannot stop the energy? That's kind of a different matter where I see it's completely different environment to deal with.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what solutions Rafael brings to the market. How does he play a role?
Well, I think in the market, there's a lot of solutions in place. We do all our part as well to offer like a scanning, asset inventory, vulnerabilities, which is, I think if you go around, they're going to be, hey, this guy is late. The market's already involved for 10 years ago. I understand. We can do that as well, but we can also integrate to all those vendors. So we are very agnostic on vendor. What we provide better is actually the financial and the risk impact to the company, taking the KPIs of cyber. So instead for me to go to a top executives and tell them about CVEs, how critical is SAV, how vulnerable can be, I go to the executive and say, look, here you go, the 300, 400 sites that you manage, there are like 10 here that you have to concentrate right now. Due to the fact if it's a hack happening here, your exposure on financial will be like 2 million. Would you like to invest on the 10 sites or the 300 sites? So I think we do more kind of a pragmatic approach based on the understanding the environment, understanding the site, understand the technology that generate the energy. Therefore, as I said to you, solar is 8 hours, wind is 24 hours, batteries twice a day. So there's a lot of components of risk criteria that we're taking in place in order to create the right profile. So when I come to the executive, I'm not giving him KPIs on cyber. which everyone is doing, and the executives are looking and say, okay, what do I do with that? Which is red is the less red of the red that I need to focus my attention on, because everything is going to be red, as we know. So I think what we try to do is say, look, those red flags that we see here actually is your kind of a hit pot where you have to invest right now, because I think the consequences are quite significant on your budget or on your impact financial situation. So that's what we try to do very well. So that's what I think distinguishes us from the market as well, because also one is our most important aspect of OT environment is we are become verticalized. And this is a big impact. Why? Because we verticalize on energy. We are experts on energy. We cannot be energy, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and everything, because and then we are not understanding the financial impact. Due to the fact that I becomes the expert on the energy, that I make sure that I speak their language. By the way, even our prices per megawatt on the subscription, make sure they understand our language as we understand their language. So it becomes a very common system to be used, because they know how much it's going to cost. Doesn't matter if it's a site 1 meg or 100 meg, is priced accordingly to the size and the needs of each site.
So when talking to clients, what are the issues that Rafael brings to the risk table when you're discussing with them?
We do. We break into categories of quick wins, big projects, and also what they need to do in order to have a fast execution. So when I present the numbers, besides of the numbers, there is action plan for them to follow. Normally, they can do that internally. They don't need to invest another company to do. The industry today, what they do, as I call it, a spray budget. So they pick one item, they believe that it's be across the board, they buy this as a budget, they say, this year I'm going to invest in patch management. Let's imagine that is the case. And that's going to be the flavor of the year. So we're going to do patch management across, right? And is the patch management the solution for everything? Or are you covering the most impactful side from the financial implication for your client? And I think when I start to talk to the client about compliance, the financial aspect, and also the risks associated to the criticality and the CVEs, and translate this in a dollar sign in the front, he understands that if he invests like maybe 100K in return of a 2 million, makes more sense than invest like 2 million across everything that maybe is not covering the aspect of deployment that we suggest in the beginning. So I think that's what we are trying to do, is giving more a framework where they can base the risk on the financial rather than the CV.
Are you just saying, hey, there are these priority CVEs out there, you really got to hit those first? Or might you bring something totally different to the table? And if so, what might that be?
Yeah, well, everything is in part of the same scenario. Today is the industry has changed. There's very few industries still air gap. If I can say still having air gap, the situation is pretty simple. Cost of operations on air gap is pretty much 3 times more than remote situation. So therefore, everything reflects to money. Even then the company might say it's not that safe, the money will always be in the front of the aspects of decision. And I think even if it's, as I said, IT, OT, IoT, whatever talks on the network, let's put it that way, including all the protocols that we cover, I think at the end of the day, what matters for any company is the financial impact and exposure. And that's what I think they are able to take the best decision when they are provided with the financial guided in front of them. So when I sell sometimes our product, yes, the CISO is part of the process. However, who buys more our products is a CFO, is a CEO, are people that are more driven by financial risk rather than technical risk. I think is important. That's for sure. You have the technical, have the compliance, you have the financial, but we combine everything under one umbrella and then say, look, that's your exposure, that's your criticality, and that's your actually a number that you have to reflect on. And I think that's what we've been very successful on our journey.
We talked a little bit about the outages in Portugal and Spain, and recently the one in Poland. How secure is the grid in general? Because Hollywood has this impression that it's easy to bring down, like all of Los Angeles, all of New York, or whatever can go dark. In his perspective, what does Rafael think? How secure is the grid?
Grid is kind of safe in a way, but you have to think about this being built for one of the oldest infrastructure of our times, right? When they built it, they didn't think about, how many generators are we going to have? How many points are we going to kind of interconnect? The demand and the supply in terms of requirement is coming from the data center, for example, right? They couldn't predict all these situations that we are seeing today. And also, I think what has speed up was to do with the pandemic as well that we just passed by, right? So that kind of enforced everything to be more digitalized, to be more remote. So before I used to control my generation under my radar, now it's everywhere, and I need to kind of control eyes on that. I think the situation of smart grid, what they call as a new name for that, but I give the same comparison of smart cars. You can have a smart cars, but you don't have the smart roads. So you don't have sensors on the road. We're still using cameras. So it's quite interesting. We are trying to try to talk about smart cars of autonomous car, which is driven by cameras and sensors, sure. But the road is still the same road as we started when we started. So the roads are not ready for that, even though that is despite is working, but it's, having a sensor on the road will be much better than actually having cameras only on the car and the dependency on the car. So I think what I'm saying is the grid ready for the supply of energy that we are seeing in contamination of a mitigation of attack? Well, we recently see that just some balancing depending on the frequency, we are not, right? This is what's happening. And I think is how fast can we improve that? There's a different order answer that I think is going to take time. But I think as the companies are getting tired to depend so much on the grid, they become decentralized. So as a data center, the data center is not going to wait for the grid. They're going to move and actually get their own decentralization field, their own generation side. And that's what I think we're here to help as well. So yeah, I think the smart grid is still not so smart as we think.
Rafael touched upon something here. Data centers, the rush to get them built in time, there's a likelihood that they're going to cut some corners and not necessarily follow everything just to get that data center online.
Yeah, no, and there is a big demand coming on that. I think data centers will be moving to as we call a multi-grid. So it's a multiple technology together to accomplish the decentralization of the energy and be less dependent on the grid, because the timeline for connections on data center in US, for example, is 5 to 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. So they're not going to wait for that time, right? And if you see the last post that I did on LinkedIn, I think yesterday from the Bloomberg, the renewables or the decentralization of the energy must double or triple from the demand they expected to have. So the numbers are going gigantic. However, it's still a lot of companies decided to do and why to do on the decentralization. I think is still a little bit of a scenario that the growth is needed. Energy is not there, and AI only going to happen if you have energy. So I think time is running fast. And if you compare to other countries, they are kind of a fully on board with the DER, right? The decentralized energy field. So I think there's a lot of things for us to see in the market happening there.
So perhaps to leave on a final thought, we're talking about this idea of decentralized energy systems entering the old grid and how they may or may not be following the rules. This really broadens the whole threat landscape, does it not?
It is totally. I think as much connectivity that you have across, so you open more, as a landscape for attacks. Not only attacks, verticalizations. Also, you have now state-sponsored acts that is looking to create any kind of a damage on the critical infrastructure. We are living a scenario of a geopolitical now that every single country today has to be, attention and taking the precaution measure. However, as you state, we move very fast into decentralization. We move very fast with the technology, but I think the democracy or the politics hasn't moved as fast as we expect to do to actually control the dynamic of growth that we had on the market today from the energy, which is the essential product that everyone consumes every day.
I'd like to thank Rafael for coming on the show and talking about the electrical grid and how we often take it for granted, but we really shouldn't. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up. We'll have more on Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and hacking utilities supply chains. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.